When the news broke that Nick Reiner had been arrested for murdering his own parents, the world didn't just react, it froze. People waited for the moment every headline promised would come, the moment he would finally confess. But it didn't happen. Nick denied everything, coldly, repeatedly. His eyes looked hollow, as if the name on the case file belonged to someone else. No tears, no shaking hands, no cracking voice. Just a blank stare that made even seasoned investigators uneasy. Then, 2 weeks later, inside a frigid interrogation room, they slid the crime scene photographs across the table, and something inside him snapped. He didn't simply cry, he collapsed, wailing like a person who had been holding his breath for years and suddenly couldn't anymore. The sound filled the room, raw and uncontrollable, as if a wall in his mind had finally given way. And that was when the truth started crawling out. Not like a clean, neat confession, not like a movie script, but in fragments, heavy, broken, terrifying. Because what Nick began to reveal wasn't just about one night. It was about a slow-burning tragedy that, in his mind, had been unfolding since childhood. A childhood spent feeling like an outsider in his own home, abandoned without being physically left behind. He told them the tragedy didn't begin with the murders. It began with something quieter, more poisonous. The feeling that he was never truly inside the family, even when he was standing right in the middle of it. Nick admitted he had never felt connected to his father, Rob Reiner, and what made it even harder to explain was that it wasn't because of a screaming fights or obvious cruelty. There were no dramatic explosions, no single moment he could point to and say, that was it. Instead, it formed slowly, over dinners, over laughter, over casual conversations where everyone seemed to belong naturally, except him. They laughed so naturally, Nick said, his voice low, and I was always standing there thinking about where I was supposed to laugh along. To outsiders, Rob Reiner looked like the image of a devoted father, successful, present, warm. He created memories that looked golden from the outside. He connected effortlessly with his other children through shared interests, movies, sports, the kinds of bonds people assume will automatically include everyone. But Nick watched it all from the sidelines. That house was safe, he said, but I didn't know how to step inside. It was as if the door was always open, but I didn't have the key. He described his father as emotionally distant, even though Rob tried. But then there was the other weight Nick couldn't escape. The enormous shadow of the Reiner name and the towering figure of Carl Reiner already carved into the public's memory. No one had to say the pressure out loud. Nick felt it anyway, every day. And in that interrogation room, he finally said the sentence that sounded like it had been living in his chest for years. I'm a defective copy, Nick blurted, then silence, as if he regretted saying it so plainly. I repeat, he said, but I don't create anything, a shadow of shadows. That isolation didn't shrink as he got older, it grew teeth. By his teenage years, Nick was withdrawing, exhausted, disconnected, and starving for a place where he didn't have to carry a famous last name like a punishment. He said he found no comfort at home, so he searched outside, anywhere that didn't ask him to be Rob Reiner's son. There, he said, no one asked whose son I was. It was enough that I existed. And in that emptiness, something appeared that promised a silence. Drugs. At first, it wasn't presented as a self-destruction. It was presented as relief, a way to make the noise in his head go quiet, a way to stop feeling like a stranger in his own life. But that escape didn't stay gentle for long. By age 15, Nick had fallen so deeply that he was sent to a rehabilitation center. He didn't describe his family as people who ignored it or pretended it wasn't happening. They didn't hide it. They didn't deny it. They kept pulling him back, again and again, trying to save him from drowning. They didn't abandon me, Nick admitted, staring down at the table, but I kept abandoning myself. And that line hung in the room like a confession all by itself, because it wasn't only about addiction, it was about a boy who didn't know how to belong, becoming a young man who didn't know how to survive being himself. The investigators listened, realizing what the public hadn't understood yet. This wasn't just a story about a crime. It was a story about a lifetime of loneliness that had been left to rot in silence. As the interrogation continued, Nick's voice softened, as if every word now required effort. What he revealed next wasn't explosive. It was quiet, and that was what made it disturbing. He began to talk about the house, not the walls, not the furniture, but the air inside it. Nick said the home was never violent, never chaotic. There were no bruises to point to, no police calls, no neighbors whispering about what happened behind closed doors. On paper, it was a stable, privileged household, everything people associate with safety. Yet Nick described it as emotionally cold in a way he couldn't explain until years later. It was like living in a museum, he said. Beautiful, quiet, and not meant to be touched. He felt constantly observed, constantly measured, even when no one was actively judging him. Conversations felt polite, controlled, almost formal. There was love, he admitted, but it came wrapped in expectations he didn't know how to meet. He spoke about dinner tables where laughter came easily to others, while he rehearsed sentences in his head before speaking, terrified of saying the wrong thing. About moments when he wanted to be comforted but didn't know how to ask without feeling weak or embarrassing. And then there was his mother. Nick described her as protective, but emotionally overwhelmed. She tried to hold the family together, tried to shield him from his own spirals, but she was exhausted. Every relapse chipped away at her strength. Every phone call from a school counselor, every late-night worry, every silent prayer added another invisible weight. Nick said he could feel her fear even when she smiled. She was always afraid, he whispered, afraid of losing me, and I hated myself for being the reason. That guilt didn't push him toward healing, it pushed him further inward. The more his parents tried to help, the more he felt like a burden. Not because they said it, but because he saw the cost in their faces. The tension, the tiredness, the constant vigilance. And slowly a dangerous thought began to form. Maybe everyone would be better if I just wasn't here. He never said it directly at the time, but looking back, Nick admitted that thought followed him everywhere. It shaped how he saw himself, how he interpreted silence, how he misunderstood concern as disappointment. He talked about therapy sessions that felt like interrogations, about medications that dulled everything, pain, joy, motivation, until life felt flat and distant. He complied, he said, but never truly believed he could be fixed. I wasn't trying to die, Nick explained. I just didn't want to feel anything anymore. As he moved into early adulthood, the gap between him and his parents didn't close. It widened, not because of hatred, but because of mutual exhaustion. They didn't know how to reach him. He didn't know how to let them in. The house grew quieter, and in that quiet, resentment quietly replaced sadness. Nick said he began replaying old memories, reinterpreting them through the lens of his pain. Moments that were once neutral became evidence. Silences became rejection. Advice became criticism. Concern became control. It's dangerous, he said, almost to himself, when your mind starts rewriting your past without asking permission. The investigators noticed something chilling then. Nick wasn't describing monsters. He was describing ordinary people trapped in a slow emotional breakdown where no one knew how to stop the collapse. And that made the question unavoidable. If this was the emotional landscape Nick had been living in, what happened on the night everything finally broke? Because whatever occurred next didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of unspoken tension, guilt, self-hatred, and isolation quietly stacking on top of each other, like a structure that looks stable, until the moment it suddenly caves in. Nick said he didn't come home looking for a fight. He came home carrying the kind of quiet rage that doesn't scream right away. It just sits there, heavy and cold, filling every corner of your body until breathing feels like work. Earlier that night, at a gathering at Conan's house, something had shifted. It wasn't a public meltdown. It wasn't a dramatic scene in front of everyone. It was smaller than that, and somehow sharper. A few clipped remarks, a few moments of avoidance, the kind of tension other people can sense even if they don't understand it. Nick said he felt cornered without anyone physically blocking out the door. And when he finally confronted his father, the response didn't feel like comfort. It felt like dismissal, like a final confirmation of the fear he'd carried for years. So he left. When he stepped outside, the cold air hit his face, and only then did he realize he was trembling. He drove home with his father's words looping in his head again and again until they stopped sounding like words and started sounding like a verdict. By the time he walked into the house, it was completely silent. The kind of silence that feels too clean, too still, like the home itself is holding its breath. Nick went into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and just stood there, staring without seeing. He said he felt empty and furious at the same time, like his emotions were colliding inside him with nowhere to go. And then he started crying, not because he wanted to, because his body couldn't hold it in anymore. "I'm lonely. I'm nothing at all," he muttered to himself, tears falling as if they had been waiting years for permission. The anger from the party was still smoldering, but now it mixed with something older and darker, a long-standing sense of being unwanted, being defective, being the mistake that everyone had tried to correct. He told investigators he thought about turning around, about going to bed, about forcing himself to breathe through it and letting the night pass like every other night. But he didn't. His feet carried him upstairs. In the master bedroom, he saw his parents sleeping peacefully. For a split second, he said, it almost looked like the kind of scene that should have made him stop, the kind of scene that should have reminded him that these were still his parents, that there was still time to pull back, but he didn't pull back. He said something inside him snapped into a kind of emotional madness he couldn't control. He lunged forward and stabbed his father first. His father jolted awake in terror, eyes wide, trying to understand what was happening in the seconds before everything became impossible to undo. He tried to speak, tried to reach him, but Nick kept going, the room filled with panic, confusion, and the sickening certainty that this was real. Then his mother woke up. Nick said she tried to stop him, tried to scream, tried to fight, But the violence didn't pause for mercy. It didn't slow down for reality. It just continued until both of them lay motionless. And when it was over, Nick collapsed onto the floor. Not triumphant, not relieved, broken. He sat there shaking, hands covered, staring at what he had done as if his brain couldn't accept that his body had actually carried it out. Then he fled. He ran out of the house, drove without direction, and checked into a seaside hotel as if distance could erase the images now burned into his mind, but nothing erased them. The scenes replayed again and again, without pause, without mercy, until his stomach turned and he couldn't breathe. He kept whispering their names even though he knew it was pointless. "I'm sorry," he repeated over and over, not even sure who he was saying it to anymore. And then came the moment the world would later hear about through official timelines and police reports. At around 3 that afternoon, a family member grew alarmed when calls went unanswered. They drove to the house to check. The moment they stepped inside, the silence changed into horror. The scene was quickly sealed off as investigators confirmed a serious domestic crime, and as the timeline came together, every question turned toward Nick. He wasn't found sobbing in a corner. He was described as calm, composed, speaking clearly, no trembling, no panic, a stillness that chilled people who heard it. Investigators concluded the attack was intentional, and Nick Reiner was formally charged. Prosecutors alleged the act was deliberate, possibly premeditated, and the case escalated into something far bigger than a private tragedy. Because now, it wasn't just about what happened in the bedroom, it was about what would happen next, in a courtroom, under the eyes of the entire public. When the case entered the courtroom, everything changed. What had once been a private family collapse was now dissected in public, sentence by sentence, under fluorescent lights. Nick sat at the defense table, silent, motionless, while strangers argued over the meaning of his life. The prosecution painted a chilling picture. They argued that Nick wasn't confused. He wasn't acting out of temporary madness. According to them, this was a deliberate act fueled by resentment and entitlement, carried out with full awareness of what he was doing. They pointed to the number of stab wounds, the sequence of the attack, the decision to flee afterward. These are not the actions of someone disconnected from reality, the prosecutor said. These are the actions of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. They described the Reiner household as supportive, patient, and repeatedly forgiving. They reminded the jury that Nick had access to treatment, therapy, rehabilitation, resources most people could only dream of. And at the center of it all stood the public image of his father, Rob Reiner, a man widely known for warmth, empathy, and humanity in both his work and his personal life. Nothing in the evidence, the prosecution insisted, suggests abuse. Nothing suggests provocation. This was not self-defense, this was murder. Then the defense stood up and told a very different story. They didn't deny the act. Instead, they focused on the mind behind it. They brought in psychiatrists who described Nick as severely mentally ill, suffering from long-term emotional instability, substance abuse disorders, and deep-rooted feelings of alienation that distorted his perception of reality. One expert explained it simply: when someone lives for years believing they are fundamentally broken, unloved, and defective, their emotional responses stop following normal rules. The defense argued that Nick wasn't acting out of hatred, but out of a psychological collapse, that had been building for decades, that on the night of the killings, his mind had fractured under pressure, creating a tunnel vision where consequences ceased to exist. They spoke about his childhood isolation, his repeated relapses, his belief that he was a burden, his inability to form a stable sense of self. This wasn't rage, the defense said. This was despair, finally losing control. As the trial continued, witnesses took the stand. Family, friends, therapists, professionals, each one adding a new layer to a story that refused to stay simple. Some described Nick as quiet, withdrawn, painfully sensitive. Others recalled warning signs that, in hindsight, felt impossible to ignore. A few admitted they never imagined it could end like this. The jury listened for weeks, and slowly the narrative shifted from what he did to who he was when he did it. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom held its breath. Nick was found guilty, but not in the way many expected. The court ruled that he was legally responsible for his actions, yet profoundly mentally ill at the time of the crime. He was sentenced to life in prison, no parole, no second chance. As the words were read, Nick didn't react. No tears, no anger, just a slight nod, as if he had already accepted this ending long before anyone else caught up. Outside the courthouse, the public argued. Some called the sentence just, others called it tragic. Many couldn't decide which emotion made more sense, because this case refused to give anyone the comfort of the clear villain or a simple explanation. It left only one unbearable truth. A family was gone, a son was lost, and no verdict could fix either. But the story didn't end with the sentence, because what followed inside prison would raise an even more haunting question. Was Nick truly capable of understanding what he had done? Or was his punishment only deepening the very isolation that destroyed him in the first place? Prison didn't feel like a punishment to Nick. It felt like confirmation. For years, he had carried the belief that he didn't belong anywhere. Now the world had finally placed him in the one location that matched the way he already saw himself. A locked box, a number, a life reduced to concrete walls and routine counts. In the beginning, people expected breakdowns, screaming, panic, regret that came in violent waves, but Nick didn't give them that. He became quiet in a way that unsettled even the guards. Not the quiet of calm, the quiet of someone who has stopped asking for rescue. In the early months, he barely spoke. He ate because food was placed in front of him. He slept because exhaustion eventually won. He followed rules because there was nothing else to do. The people around him thought he was cold, but inside, Nick was drowning, because in prison, there was no distraction. No distance, no escape route, no way to outrun memory. Every night, the same images returned. A bedroom, a sudden movement, his father's shocked eyes, his mother's terror, the sound of his own breathing turning ragged, the silence afterward that felt louder than any scream. He would wake up with his heart pounding, drenched in sweat, staring at the ceiling like it was the only thing holding him down to reality. And then the guilt would arrive, not dramatic, not cinematic, just heavy. It sat on his chest like a stone that never moved. He wrote letters he never sent, pages filled with apologies that couldn't bring anyone back, words scratched out and rewritten because no sentence felt honest enough to carry what he had done. Sometimes he would stare at the paper for an hour, then tear it into pieces. Because what do you write when the only truth is unforgivable? Other inmates watched him closely. Some avoided him, some whispered about him. A few wanted to provoke him, just to see if the famous kid would snap again. But Nick didn't snap. He shrank. The years that followed didn't make him harder. They made him thinner, like his identity was dissolving one day at a time. He stopped being Nick. He stopped being anyone's son. He became a shadow walking through a schedule. There were moments, though, when the mask slipped. A guard once described seeing him pause in the hallway when someone on a nearby TV laughed loudly at a comedy rerun. Nick didn't laugh. He just stood still, staring, as if the sound of joy didn't belong in his universe anymore. Another time, during a routine check, an officer asked him a simple question: "How are you holding up?" Nick didn't answer at first. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he murmured, "I don't think I'm supposed to be holding up at all." After that, he went back to silence. And that was the haunting part. Prison wasn't transforming him. It was preserving him in the exact state he had been in on the night everything fell apart, trapped inside his own mind, sealed off from the rest of the world. The public moved on, the headlines faded, new scandals replaced old ones. But inside that cell, Nick lived in one endless loop, and the people who followed the case began to wonder something terrifying. If his life had always been defined by isolation, then wasn't prison the most perfect place to finish destroying him? Because while the world saw a convicted killer serving life, Nick saw something else. A boy who never learned how to belong. A man who finally proved his worst fear true, that he was and always had been the problem. Years passed, and Nick Reiner became the kind of inmate people stopped noticing. Not because his case was forgotten completely, but because the routine of prison has a cruel way of flattening even the most shocking stories. New arrivals came in with louder crimes, louder personalities, louder chaos. Nick stayed quiet, he stayed small, but there was one thing he couldn't escape: his last name. Even behind bars, it followed him like a shadow. Guards recognized it. Inmates recognized it. Every so often, someone would say it out loud or slowly like a dare: "Reiner." And every time, Nick would stiffen, as if the name itself was a reminder that he once belonged to a world he had permanently destroyed. He didn't talk about his father, not publicly, not casually, not in the way people expected a guilty man to talk about the dead, because every time he tried to form the words in his head, they collapsed under their own weight. If he admitted he missed them, it sounded monstrous. If he admitted he hated them, it sounded monstrous. If he said nothing, people called him empty. So he lived in the only place that felt accurate: silence. The prison staff recorded long stretches where he showed no emotion at all. Then, suddenly, without warning, he would break down in a way that looked almost childlike. Not rage, not theatrics, just grief pouring out of him like a wound that never closed. One counselor wrote that Nick didn't speak like a man seeking forgiveness. He spoke like a man who didn't believe forgiveness existed. "I don't deserve to be understood," he said once, staring down at his hands. "But I also don't understand myself." That sentence became the center of the case's darkest mystery, because it forced a question the public hates more than violence. What if Nick wasn't a monster in the way people want monsters to be? What if he was something worse for our sense of safety? A human being whose mind slowly broke while everyone around him watched, tried, failed, and kept living. That idea terrified people, because if you accept that, then the story isn't simple anymore. It's not evil versus good. It's not bad son versus innocent parents. It becomes a tragedy where no one wins and everyone loses something that can't be repaired. The more people looked back, the more the warning signs seemed obvious in hindsight. The addiction, the detachment, the repeated attempts to pull him back from the edge, the years of feeling like he didn't belong, the belief that he was a defective copy in a family filled with brilliant originals. Yet none of those things are crimes. They are just the kind of quiet suffering that, for most families, stays private until one day it doesn't. And that is what made this case so haunting. Not only because two people died, but because it forced the world to stare at the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the greatest danger isn't a stranger outside your door. Sometimes it's the slow, invisible collapse happening inside someone you love, while you keep telling yourself it will get better. And that leads to the final, cruelest twist of all, because even if Nick could go back, even if he could rewind that night, even if he could stop his own hands, would he have known how to stop the years of loneliness that came before it? Or was the tragedy already unfolding long before the bedroom door ever opened? There is a moment in every true tragedy where people wait for meaning, a lesson, a warning, a clear reason that makes the pain feel useful. But this story never gives that relief. Nick Reiner will spend the rest of his life inside prison walls, aging in a place that freezes people in the worst version of themselves. He will never rebuild a family. He will never outrun his last name. He will never undo the night that defined him forever. And his parents will never come back. No courtroom explanation can resurrect them. No psychological diagnosis can make their absence easier to carry. No sentence can balance what was lost. What remains is something far more unsettling. Silence. Silence in a house that will never hear their voices again. Silence in a prison cell where regret has no expiration date. Silence in a story that refuses to tell us who to blame without also implicating everyone else. Because the most disturbing truth isn't what Nick did. It's that nothing about his life looked explosive from the outside. There was no single scream loud enough to warn the world. No visible collapse dramatic enough to force intervention. Just years of quiet suffering masked by privilege, success, and the illusion of a stability. And that is why this case continues to haunt people, not because it's rare, but because it's terrifyingly human. A reminder that loneliness can grow even in loving homes, that help doesn't always reach the places it's sent, that some minds fracture slowly, silently, while the world keeps moving. Nick once said something during a private evaluation that never made headlines. "I don't think I was born broken," he whispered. "I think I just didn't know how to ask to be fixed." That sentence doesn't excuse what he did. Nothing ever will. But it does leave us with a question that has no easy answer. How many people are quietly unraveling right now, while everyone around them assumes they are fine? And if we never learn how to hear the quietest cries for help, how many tragedies are already in motion, waiting for the night everything breaks? This story doesn't end with justice. It ends with a warning, and the warning is simple, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. Sometimes the danger isn't hatred, it's silence. This is where most stories try to comfort you. They tell you justice was served. They tell you the system worked. They tell you to move on. But this story refuses to do that. Because if you strip away the headlines, the courtroom drama, the famous last name, and the horror of the crime, what's left is something deeply uncomfortable, A son who never learned how to belong. Parents who tried but didn't know how to reach him. A system that he stepped in only after everything was already destroyed. Nothing about this ending feels complete. Nick Reiner will wake up every day inside a prison cell knowing that the people he wanted to feel close to are gone because of his own hands. That knowledge doesn't fade, it doesn't soften, it doesn't turn into wisdom or redemption. It just stays. And somewhere else, 2 lives ended without ever knowing how badly their son was losing himself inside. That is the part no verdict can touch. This case doesn't ask you to forgive. It doesn't ask you to excuse. It asks you to pay attention. Because the most dangerous pain is not the loud kind. It's the pain that hides behind normal conversations, polite smiles, and families that look fine from the outside. If there is a lesson here, it's not about crime, it's about silence. The silence of people who don't know how to ask for help. The silence of families who assume love is always enough. The silence of warning signs we only recognize when it's already too late. And once that silence breaks, it never breaks gently. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's the point. If it stayed with you longer than you expected, that's because it should. And if you want more stories like this, stories that don't just tell you what happened, but force you to ask why, then make sure you stay with this channel. Because some truths aren't meant to be forgotten, they're meant to be faced. If you found this story powerful, leave a comment with your thoughts. Subscribe for more deep, unsettling true stories, and share this video. Not for shock, but for awareness. Because sometimes the only thing louder than violence is the silence that comes before it.